Okay, well, good morning, everyone. We're thrilled to have you all here with us this morning for our January Coffee and Conversations. My name is Dan Bromberg. I'm the Director of Academic Programs for the Carsey School of Public Policy. And this is an ongoing series that many of you have been joining us at for a number of years now. We're thrilled to kick off the new year with Brian Gottlob. Brian is the Director of the New Hampshire Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau. Prior to accepting that position, Brian was the principal of Polycon, research and economic consulting firm that was located in Dover. For more than 3 decades, Brian has analyzed economic, demographic, labor market, industry trends for corporate trade associations, government agencies. So really a deep background in this area. And in Brian's current role, he's looking at labor related to state and local levels, government employment, and things related to that. So we're really excited for this talk, Brian. We're thrilled to have you. Brian is going to give a quick presentation, and then, as always, we're going to open it up to questions from our attendees. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A feature. You're welcome to drop your questions into that. And I will facilitate the discussion after Brian's presentation. If you have any comments or anything, you could always send them to the panelists in the chat feature as well. And we will let those know that closed captions are enabled, so we'll drop that in the chat just so those that need that have access to it. All right, Brian, I will turn it over to you, and we'll let the talk begin.
Thank you very much, Dan. Really a pleasure to be here to address this group. I've seen and read about many of these, and always wondered how one went about getting on the program. And out of the blue, it happened not too long after I started thinking about that. So I'm going to go through, as Dan said, a relatively quick presentation, as quick as I am genetically able to, which is not usual. My presentations usually run a little bit long. This one I tried to keep very short. I'm coming at this from a couple of perspectives. Generally, I don't like a lot of anecdotal information, but in my role, I've had the experience of having people leave my organization and having to hire. So I have that firsthand experience, as well as looking at the data from an aggregate perspective. What I present to you in this presentation is largely kind of an aggregate overview of what's happening. I'm going to start out here trying to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. I'm going to start out by just giving you a really quick overview of where we are generally in the labor market in New Hampshire. And I think we've been very successful in New Hampshire from an employment perspective, as the nation has. This is a chart that shows the perspective of 2 separate recessions. The blue line represents the Great Recession, and the burnt orange line represents the pandemic recession. And what this chart shows is how long it took in months to recover all of the private sector jobs that were lost during each of those recessions. And during the Great Recession, it took almost 7 years to get back all of the private sector jobs that we lost. The pandemic recession, we've done so in less than 30 months. So we've been pretty successful in hiring, in our ability to get people back to work. But there's some exceptions, and some of those exceptions have to do with changes in industries, changes in the economy. One of the areas that has seen the least ability to recover jobs has been in government, and particularly in state and local government. And this chart highlights those 2 industries. They're near the bottom, comparing pre-pandemic recession employment levels to levels during the end of the second quarter of 2022. And I use that data, by the way, because that's the best data that we have. That's based on an actual census and employment records that we keep here at the Department of Employment Security. So it's not an estimate, it is the actual number of jobs. So state and local government are still well below where they were prior to the recession. The only other industries that are worse off are retail trade, and that's largely a function of changes in the industry brought about in part by the pandemic or accelerated by the pandemic, a movement toward more online retailing, but also hospitals. Hospitals have struggled because the medical profession has been among the hardest hit in terms of labor shortages. They are perennially near the top of job openings, particularly for nurses and some other occupations. So state and local government still have not recovered. And it's not because, from my perspective, at least the evidence that I have, that state and local governments have necessarily shed a lot of workers. Certainly state government hasn't, but they haven't been able to hire, and they have a number of retirements. They've had a number of resignations. A number of people in my organization have left for private sector jobs, and that's made it more challenging to get back to full staffing levels. From my perspective, there are a number of unique challenges to state and local government staffing. All industries are facing a likely long period of time where there'll be labor shortages. Labor force growth is slow nationally. It's even slower in New Hampshire. And that means probably from my perspective, the most valuable resource in the economy is going to be individuals, and particularly smart, well-educated individuals. So here's some of the issues that we'll face. Again, industries nationally will face labor shortages, but government faces some additional challenges in the competition for labor, and we do compete for labor. I've competed for labor. I've had to hire a number of people over the last year or two, and I faced some really stiff competition competing with what the private sector offers. I'm looking for people with technical skills, economics, statistics background, and those people are in relatively high demand. So demographics is working against the state and local government workforce. It's an older workforce, will mean more retirements, greater replacement needs. Even if government isn't growing the number of employees, it's still going to have a lot of hiring needs because of the replacements. And there's relatively high quit rates that have increased. That turnover makes hiring, increases the number of hires that state and local governments need. So my personal perspective is, and looking at the data, is that we have difficulty hiring and keeping younger workers. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think some of it has to do with the aspects of the work environment, but also, at least in state government, is the hiring rules. I've run up against this in my organization, making it difficult to hire young people, skilled people who lack experience. And government really has an inability to, on the fly at least, adjust compensation. We have very, very minimal ability to do that. And we're competing for occupations that can be in very high demand. And when that's the case, we know the market responds by offering higher wages. That's really difficult to do in government, state and local government. I've struggled with this. I'm sure local governments have the same restrictions based on contracts, et cetera, union rules. I also think that the relative lack of flexible work opportunities that are increasingly important to workers are making it hard. Certainly, again, relying on some anecdotal evidence, I have had people not accept job offers because we did not offer a hybrid work. We've increased some of the flexibility. We're looking at offering some remote work opportunities, but still it can be more difficult, I believe, in government. And I think the career paths and opportunities for advancement are not particularly clear. Again, this very structured human resources and contract and union rules make it very difficult to necessarily promote people. It's not clear where, and I've had this asked of me in many job interviews, where can I go after, if I accept this position after a few years, what are my opportunities? And it's not always clear where that is. So I think that makes it challenging for young people. And lastly, just again from personal experience, rigid job qualifications, it just makes an experience, looking to hire young workers. I did manage to hire a young graduate from UNH with an analytical economics degree. The position required 5 years of experience. Very difficult to hire any young, individual looking for experience when the job requires 5 years experience. He could do it with his eyes closed with his skills. So I think it makes it particularly challenging, and the results, when you look at the demographics of state and local government workforce, show that it's difficult to hire younger individuals. This chart just shows the ratio of young workers. I look at workers age 22 and above, 22 to 34 compared to those 55 and above, kind of the young versus the old. We know that 55 and above are going to be of retirement age over the next decade. And in order to compensate for that, you need to have a steady supply of workers at younger ages. And this chart just shows you in broad industry groupings that government is at the bottom in terms of that ratio. So clearly not able or not as an attractive environment for younger workers. And by the way, I've done this analysis for 200 industries when I break it down, and government is still near the bottom. State and local governments are near the bottom. And that's particularly challenging. Again, that means more retirements, and it's not as much of a challenge if the industry is shrinking, but government's not likely to shrink. So those retirements and the lack of younger workers will make it especially challenging to fill needs in state and local government. This data combines both some national data and New Hampshire data, and it's what I call the unfilled job openings rate. Basically, it looks at the job openings rate, which is the number of jobs that businesses indicate they have that are unfilled, that they're looking to fill. And the job openings rate is that number plus the number of employed people divided by the job openings. And there's a hiring rate, which is the same. So the difference between the openings and the hiring rate is what I call the unfilled job openings rate. So you see, following the worst of the pandemic, which is where the big dip is in that line, huge number of openings, a lot of resignations, a lot of retirements. So the job openings rate shot up. Labor force also contracted, so the unfilled jobs were strong. And New Hampshire is a little bit more labor constrained, or significantly more labor constrained. So our unfilled jobs rate has been largely higher than the US for much of the post-pandemic period, if there is such a thing as a post-pandemic period. But what I found really interesting, and this is national data because we don't have this data for state and local governments specifically in New Hampshire, is that across the nation, state and local governments are struggling to fill openings, and they have for some time. The unfilled job openings rate in state and local government has exceeded the overall rate for this time period. If I took it back even further, back to 2010, for much of that time, state and local governments have had more unfilled job openings. That says something about the relative attractiveness to workers of working in state and local government, or maybe a declining attractiveness of working in state and local government, but it clearly is an issue. I did a presentation for the state personnel office a few months ago, and one of the points that I tried to make, the state, digress here a little bit, the state is looking to consolidate its job classifications, to come up with a new job classification system. It's overly complicated. Many more classifications than are needed. And they're looking, and that's a wonderful activity, going from a couple of thousand job classifications to a few hundred. But my point to that group that is looking to do that is that you can have the best classification system in the world, but if you don't have the ability to base your compensation on market realities, you're going to have difficulty hiring. And this is one example. The occupation that has been most in demand, the most openings over the last several years, has been nurses of all types. So I took a look at what the state of New Hampshire was offering nurses in its job postings. And they were, this was a few months ago again, $62,000 a year. So I went, and that probably was based on some data that my organization, along with the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, we work in conjunction with them, produces in terms of what average and median wages are in the state for different occupations. That data has a lag of about a year. So over the past year, the market for all occupations has changed and wages have gone up significantly. So the result is that a few months ago during the summer, New Hampshire was offering $62,000 a year. That was about $13,000 below what the average or median wage for nurses was in the state, so much lower. And it was $29,000 when I looked at what organizations across the state were advertising their nursing positions for. So clearly the state was not being competitive. So it doesn't matter what classification system we had and how good it is. It was clearly a situation where we weren't responding to the market. And I found that in my hiring decisions where I've lost potential employees because I simply could not offer a competitive salary for somebody with analytical skills and technical skills. Another issue I mentioned is the lack of remote work opportunities or hybrid work opportunities. This is a chart. During the pandemic, I started following Google mobility reports. Basically, it's a measure of how many trips to workplaces were made during a day compared to pre-pandemic levels. And as you see on the far left of this, as at the worst of the pandemic, trips to workplaces were down 50% or more. They did recover, but it still remains about 15 to 20% below where it was prior to the pandemic. That, to me, says that remote and hybrid work opportunities are going to continue. And most governments, and state government in particular, was very, very reluctant and very slow in offering remote work opportunities. My organization has not had any remote work opportunities. We're looking at a policy to do some of that. And I think, again, that reduces the attractiveness of state and local government workforce. And clearly any forward-facing, public-facing jobs can't be work remotely. But I think state and local government is going to have to figure out ways to increase that if it's going to remain competitive. Almost done here. Looking at the demographics again, I said the distribution of workers by age, state and local government, and I strip out education here because that's a little bit different workforce. What this shows, state and local government, the blue bars, has an older workforce. Over a third are likely in retirement age over the next decade. So it's a significantly older workforce and smaller percentage of younger workforce. Clearly not as attractive. And when you think about it, compensation isn't as high. Generally, compensation is made up to a degree by a better benefit package. But for a lot of younger workers, the benefits just aren't as important. Certainly the healthcare benefits don't seem to be as important. One of my suggestions was we offer younger workers the opportunity to exchange cash remuneration for health benefits. I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but it could possibly be a win for both workers and government in terms of savings. Just again, ratio of younger workers to older workers in the private sector, the blue line, it's declined everywhere. But it's declined in public sector as well, but it's been much lower in the public sector, and it's been lower for a long time. Public sector is not as an attractive work environment for younger people. In addition, I believe workers tend to hang on a little bit longer in the public sector, particularly when we talk about health benefits. It's important for older workers. Again, point I want to make is that this is not unique to New Hampshire. I did a presentation to the New England State Government Finance Officers Association earlier this year. So I looked at this data for all New England states, and that ratio of young to old workers, older workers, kind of remains true throughout, and it's probably true throughout the country. But in New Hampshire, Rhode Island are among the worst here. And just looking at the last chart here, just looking at the percentage of adult workers that are 22 to 34 in government versus the private sector, you see that government much lower in all of the New England states. And with that, I will stop and we can have a discussion, hopefully.
So really interesting data. And I'll open it up to all of our attendees. If you have any questions, please just drop them into the Q&A. We don't allow attendees to come on and speak at this point. So if you just drop them in the Q&A, that would be great, and I could feed them to Brian. So there are so many questions that kind of come to mind. One of them is related to kind of just retraining some of our workforce. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've thought about, as far as, depending on, obviously, if you need someone with an analytics economics background, maybe that's not something that we can do. But obviously there are folks that are looking to work. There are folks that don't necessarily have the skill sets that the public sector needs. Is retraining kind of part of this conversation?
It clearly is. There's two primary issues that are confronting labor force. One, there's a labor shortage because people have stepped out of the labor force. In New Hampshire, we're 1% below where we were prior to the pandemic, so that's about 8,000 people fewer. If you add in population growth, we're down about 18,000 or so compared to pre-pandemic levels if the normal participation rate had held up. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is the job match aspect of it. There are openings and there are people. There are people looking for work, but this was a problem prior to the pandemic. There's a mismatch between the opportunities that are out there and the skills that are available. One of the things that I've stressed, and this is beyond, I'm a data nerd. I'm not really in the reemployment aspect of it, but one of the things that I've tried to stress with my colleagues who are in that business is that we have to change New Hampshire employment security, because people don't want to go to an organization when the only reason they go there is because they're unemployed. We have to become more of an employment services organization. People don't want to go to the hospital. They don't want to go to the unemployment office. Our challenge is not just getting people back into the same jobs, it's getting people back into the jobs that are in demand, making sure they're aware of the jobs that are in demand. And we are stepping up, Dan, our retraining programs. There's a lot of opportunities, and there's a lot of opportunities that businesses are taking advantage of. One of the issues that has occurred over the last couple of decades is that the training offered by businesses has declined pretty significantly, and it's changed. It's not only less training, but it's been more focused on management training and less on, the skills that production workers or frontline workers, lower level workers, and that has to change. And I think they're recognizing that, and they're looking to partner with organizations like state government and federal government and some of the training programs to do that. So retraining is a big part of the potential solution.
Yeah, great. And I recognize you'll venture outside of your box a little bit, but you do like relying on the numbers as far as kind of some of these answers. So I'm happy to jump into this. Certainly a space that I've looked at. Obviously the Carsey School helps to train these people with our MPA program, our MPP program. So this is a world that I'm familiar with as well. Lots of questions kind of piling in here on our chat board. So let me just start with kind of a straightforward one. Has this information been shared with the commissioners of the various departments?
Well, not all of them, but I did share it with the State Personnel Office. And I will tell you, and I don't know, I probably shouldn't say this, but I meet on a monthly basis with the governor's office and policy advisors. And I've shared with them a lot of data because it's been a concern, the inability to hire. And one of the governor's policy advisors said, Brian, I probably shouldn't tell you this, and the governor won't admit it, but I think that data has convinced him that we need to offer some remote work opportunities. So I think it's filtering. I think it's filtered through with the office of the State Personnel Office. They're looking at it a little differently. As I said, they had already undergone a recognition that they need to redo the classification system, but that's just part of it. They need to, from my perspective, the biggest thing that they need to understand is that labor market is a market. It's a free market. People sell their services, and unless we can respond in a way that individuals who participate in the market do, we're going to have a hard time hiring, and that's the most difficult aspect.
Yeah, and Don Bliss posted a question here that is related to this, which says job security, benefit packages, defined pensions, right, and concepts of contributing to the good of society used to be factors that attracted people to the public sector, in spite of lower salaries. And the question is, how has this changed? So curious if you have any thoughts on that. I certainly have a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think I think it's changed probably for younger workers. And I think that's the challenge. I think that's one. I don't think those things are as certainly I think the whole benefit package issue isn't as important to younger workers, at least not the ones that I've spoken with and the ones that I've looked to hire. I think the notion of public service and doing something of value to society does have appeal to younger workers. I don't think it's necessarily a part of the recruitment efforts, however. That's not something that, at least in state government, is necessarily part of the pitch to younger workers. And I think it would help. It certainly would help. We'll see the next real downturn we have in the economy. People tend to look more favorably at government employment during that time. We're in a period where there's demand in all industries, so we're facing more competition. But I do think that it would be, there's an appeal to that is largely underutilized, an appeal to the better nature, the value of public service that, from my perspective, at least in state government, hasn't been employed.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, obviously as an MPA program director, and we're thinking about, attracting students to an MPA program with the idea that they're eventually working for state and local government, potentially nonprofits. What we're seeing is there's also an increase in this concept of businesses doing good, right? So,
right. Yeah.
So the idea of public service and the idea of, having impact is not limited to government service, and often not even associated with government service. Right. So you see that shift with younger students too. Changes the game.
That's a great point. I do think that it's more identified with not-for-profit organizations than with government, and that's a fault of government for not making that a part of the pitch that they make to potential employees.
So here's the kind of more general question from Gavin, which is, why is government more rigid than the private sector in terms of offering more pay, remote work opportunities? Yeah, kind of all of those points.
It's my career has largely been in the private sector, so it was a shock to come to the public sector. And I think it's probably a combination of, more restrictions because of collective bargaining. Every change, and I see this in my organization, every change has to be negotiated. Almost every change in the working environment, in the work situation. I don't have the ability to just offer, if I want a student, recent grad who had wonderful technical skills, I want that person. That person can do the job. They don't quite fit in terms of their experience. They could get a better salary. I don't have that ability to change it. And, I had this discussion with human resource people. When I tried to get someone hired at a higher pay rate, the response was, but Brian, what does that say about treating everybody equally? And my response was, you know what? Not everybody is equal. And that's part of the problem in government, is that we cannot reward the people. I have people who do outstanding work, and I cannot give them the rewards that they deserve in order to guarantee that they'll stay around, that they'll feel more fulfilled or valued.
There's a good amount of literature in this space, right? So there's a good amount of research in this space, and it's there is a shift, right? I mean, Jonathan, this kind of gets to what you were noting in the Q&A, which is related regarding remote work or hybrid work. Is the public sector at a disadvantage due to what is called the fairness issue, right? For example, administrative staff at public works may be able to work remotely, but plow drivers cannot. Same for fire and police, right? So there's kind of this idea that, well, this is not a concept that can work across the board. So we need to think about that, right? So, I mean, obviously, historically, we're kind of stuck in these bureaucratic systems, right? And changing them is challenging. The flip side argument, though, is that people that tend to migrate towards the public sector are potentially motivated by other factors other than just incentivizing them with cash benefits or with money. And there's some great stories. If you go back, there's a professor at Harvard right now. His name's Bob Bain, BEHN, and he kind of tells these stories anecdotally about various mayors or managers doing things, and great stories about a mayor might walk in and give the sanitation crew that collected the most trash tickets to the baseball game that night. Or you simply have awards and you celebrate your employees differently. This takes effort, and it takes time for people to actually think about how we do this well. But cash incentives aren't the only way to do this. So the question is, how do we do it well, and how do we continue to incentivize people, even if we don't have that flexibility that our private sector competition does have?
Right.
It's just the box we're in. A question here from Will. Will's asking, do you know of any municipalities in New Hampshire that are seeing success with attracting and retaining young employees? If so, what are they doing? What's working out there? Do we know if anything is working, even kind of broader than Will's question?
Yeah, I don't, I don't get down to that level. I would be interested in hearing those stories, because that's one of the things that we try to do. I know more of what's happening in the private sector, and one of the things that we try to do, and I try to do, is to share those success stories, because everybody is struggling to hire workers. Every organization, every private sector organization that I've talked to has struggled with, and I've heard all the stories of what they've tried to do. Relatively few of them are successful, but when they are successful, we try and spread that. I have the same regarding any issue with communities' demographics. There are some, communities that are really struggling demographically with older populations, but there's some communities that are doing things that are resulting in very positive. So communities are not monolithic. I'm sure there are those success stories, and that would be a wonderful task for the municipal association or any organization to spread those. We hear a lot about the challenges that communities face. We don't hear enough about the successes, because my view is that there are successes in almost every area among some communities, and we do not do a good job of sharing those. So sorry, I don't have the answer.
No, it's a look, you're right. It's an important thing that we do celebrate those and share that so we can learn from each other. And we need to find where those opportunities are actually happening. I have a data question for you. So right up your alley on this. Though not all state nursing positions require extensive experience, many, such as nursing home surveyors, do. Thus, is it possible that the salary gap data understates the difference?
Not really, because we do have salary data. I probably wasn't clear enough on that, for all levels of nursing. And I've learned a lot about the nursing field in terms of the career ladder and the progression. So you have at the lower end, nursing assistants, which are relatively low pay, and then you progress up. So the data that I showed was for registered nurses, which is a particular category and skill level and an educational requirement. So I don't think it does distort it that way. I'm sure there's some distortions, but I assure you that there's a significant wage gap in almost, I did a number of those. I did some IT professions or occupations in my presentation to the state personnel office, and I showed a similar kind of gap. So almost across the board, the gap is pretty significant. And one of the things that the state tries to do, or at least our organization did, is that they would add in the benefits. And if I was trying to hire somebody, we would put together and say, here's what you get in benefits in terms of healthcare and whatnot. And it's still rarely compensated for the other package that in the private sector. So I don't think it's distorted. I think it's pretty clear that at least at the state level, the wages are generally lower than in the private sector for comparable occupations.
So we have a question here from Dennis, kind of just related to rules, union contracts, but basically the various constraints that the public sector is dealing with. Are you familiar with any ways that we could kind of quickly respond to the market pressure and the competition that we're seeing? So you have someone who's looking at a job in the private sector, looking at a job in the public sector. Comp is obviously better in the private sector. Is there a way for the public sector to deal with that?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, and I'm most familiar with what at the state level, but there are steps in each occupation or each job classification. There's 8 or 9 steps. Ideally, when you're hired, you're generally hired at the bottom step, the number 1. When I have tried to hire people, I've been told, well, occasionally we can go to number 2. A stretch would be number 3. I need to be able to hire some people with technical skills at number 5 or 6. The problem is when you do that, as I mentioned before, anecdotally, well, what does that say to the last person who you brought in at a comparable position at number 2? Well, the difference is 1 year and a labor market that has changed, and competition for people with technical skills it has changed. So it's just simple, at least in the state, we should have a range. You can go, we have 9 steps. You can go anywhere along that grade, and that makes a pretty significant salary difference. The problem is, it creates another problem, is that now you don't have the ability to give that person a raise the longer they stay. So it's really challenging. There are things we can do to get people in. There's less that we can do to keep them in because we cannot adjust the compensation. And again, those wage scales are pretty much set in stone. We just don't have the ability to offer whatever we think the market said. We should have, and I did pitch this, we should adjust those wage scales based on market considerations, or at least add, we should have a 10 or 20%, whatever, range based on, and I propose this because I can look at job postings and see how difficult it is to hire every occupation in the state. I know what the intensity of postings is, how long they last. So we could develop, and I did pitch this, we could develop a metric that says, if we reach this level, then of difficulty in hiring, we have the flexibility to adjust the pay a certain percentage. Again, that has to go through all of the union negotiations in order to do that, but that's the way to do it. There are ways to do it. We just haven't done it.
We have a question here from Theodore, which I'm happy to take an initial stab at, which is flexibility, remote working opportunities, flexible work hours, et cetera, are related to trust and management of the workforce. Simply put, many state managers do not want to manage a workforce that is not in the office. I think this is related to trust and management skills. Thoughts about this? You know, I think that's certainly part of it, Theodore. I think there's also, what we've seen in this bounce back is that, we are able to engage in different ways when we're in person. And we haven't necessarily gotten the technology to a point where, it's the same as me just walking in and knocking on your door and saying, hey, I have an idea, let's talk about that. UNH, for example, we use Microsoft Teams. There's obviously the feature where you could just drop in kind of on someone and say, hey, how's it going? What can I do there? I think as a culture, getting to a point where working remotely doesn't mean working from your car, working from, your kid's soccer game. It actually means working in a specific location, just not in your office. I don't know that we're fully there yet. I think trust and management skills certainly have something to do with it. But I think that there's also different levels of productivity that happen. So I'll give you one more example, which is, in our office space, it's hard to have a conversation like this because the sound resonates. So I have someone that prefers to have all of their Zoom meetings from their home office because it's quieter and it allows them to do that, right? So we might think about, okay, how do we shift and use our spaces differently? When do we want to engage socially and have people in a space together versus when do we think that it might be more productive for them to be working from a home office or whatever it might be? So I think there is space. I think certainly trust and management are part of that, but I don't think they're the only thing. I think even if I trusted all of my employees 100%, it doesn't mean I want them working from home 100% because part of their functions are to be student facing in certain cases or whatever it might be. So that's my shot at that. Brian, one last question here. Any thoughts on where to go to find the folks looking for work? So basically, what are the venues? Where can we find these people?
Yeah, that's the question that everybody wants answered. Everyone's trying everything. They're advertising. You see television advertising. I see some manufacturers that are regularly advertising on TV. Come, join this team. I've seen service organizations advertising on TV. Social media is big. Obviously, hitting all the job boards. Posting with our organization is one way. There's nothing that I have heard that is a magic bullet. The greater your presence, the more likely you are to find candidates. Simply posting a job is probably not likely to yield a tremendous response. The organizations that I have seen that have had the most, I'll give you one example. Fidelity last year indicated they wanted to hire 1,200 people in New Hampshire, 600 customer service types, high-level customer service, and 600 technical, financial, computer, IT, etc. They have had all kinds of media campaigns in order to do that. Obviously, most organizations don't need to hire 1,200, but they've had limited success. I've seen manufacturers, BA Systems, do the same kinds of things. The bottom line is the biggest issue that we face is that we have 8,000 fewer people in the labor force looking for work. And if we look at the trend in terms of our population growth, we probably have anywhere from 12 to 14,000 people fewer than we should have. In that environment, every organization that needs to hire is going to struggle. So the one thing we can do, and my organization is working on this, is get people back into the labor force. We have to make them aware of the opportunities and get them back into the labor force, and that will make everybody's hiring a little bit easier.
Yeah, it's a really great point, as far as just the numbers, right? The numbers tell us this. What it suggests to me, and kind of what I'm a big advocate for, are partnerships, and kind of thinking strategically about how we develop that workforce that you're talking about, Brian. Obviously, I'm at an institution where we hope to think about, where are students landing, 3 to 5 years from now, and developing partnerships so we have pathways to employment for our students. But even more than that, you think at a bigger scale. There are some great examples. I lived in North Carolina about 15 years ago. The Greenville, kind of Spartanburg, South Carolina area, which was just south of where I lived. BMW moved in there. A handful of the larger car manufacturers moved in there, and they invested in some of these community college systems. Developing that employment. Now that's not necessarily a policy solution, but it's a partnership. And I think the more we think about these partnerships, the more we think about how can we, as a community, public, private, university education systems, create these opportunities. We're gonna help to develop that pipeline. Because we're not going to solve this tomorrow, right? These are things we need to think about.
I do think that's a great point, though, is that some of these organizations that I mentioned have developed relationships with higher education institutions. Fidelity has done it with community colleges. I think they do some things with the university system. I know BA Systems does. These developing relationships with educational institutions is absolutely critical, and I think the most forward-thinking businesses and organizations have looked to do that. They want to establish, and and the benefit to higher education institutions is that sometimes these organizations will fund some of the work that needs to be done to train people. So there's a symbiotic relationship to be had there, I think.
Okay. Just so folks know, it's hard. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat. The chat is kind of for everyone to take a look at. I am looking at the Q&As. We have a few more here, and we'll probably keep Brian on the hook for about 5 more minutes, and then we will thank everyone for their attendance. So a couple things. One, are you aware of any state or local governments outside of New Hampshire that have successfully negotiated this 10 to 20% flexibility in wage based on labor market conditions, or higher starting step, based on technical skills? Is that out there?
I'm not aware of that, but that was one of the suggestions that I made to the state personnel office, that they look for those, because I have to think that many government organizations, state government organizations, are looking to do that. Again, I'm not unusual, but I'm kind of out of my lane in terms of solving these problems. I just point out the the data and what it shows, and offer these solutions. So I really don't. I haven't looked at that, but I think that's an excellent way to go. My guess is they are all struggling with the same kinds of issues that New Hampshire is struggling with, and every state government is likely to be dealing with a number of public sector unions, and so that can make it difficult. But if there is one out there, I think it definitely should be highlighted, and I'm hoping that New Hampshire, and I'll work back to the state planning office or state personnel office and see if anybody has found that.
Why is there such a labor shortage and yet unemployment is low?
Well, first of all, they're related. There's a labor shortage because there's not a lot of people looking for work. There's not a lot of people laid off, and if they're laid off, the potential for their skills to match what the skills that are in demand is not good. First of all, I hate the unemployment rate, by the way, my least favorite economic indicator. I'm a fan of the employment to population ratio, and particularly for individuals 25 to 54, because that's a group that generally participates in the labor force, very high levels, generally employed. And that's showing us that there's still quite a bit of slack in the labor market, while you look at the unemployment rate, and that suggests that there isn't a lot of slack in the labor market. The unemployment rate right now is basically saying, at 2.6% or so, that there just isn't a lot of labor to be had. And that's true to the extent that there's not a lot of labor people looking for work who are unemployed, but it's not true in terms of the number of people who are sitting on the sidelines. So when I look at the EPOP, employment to population ratio, we're down a couple of percentage points from where we should be. And when you translate that, that's that 15 to 16,000 people who I see, I'll use an industrial term, capacity utilization of the labor force. We are underutilizing the capacity of our working age population right now, severely. And that means, our fundamental challenge is, what do we have to do to get that capacity utilization of labor up to a higher level?
We have one question here that I think I missed earlier. Donna, I'll rephrase it slightly. Do you think cash benefits for younger workers or individuals will draw people in? It says, why don't you think providing cash benefits will work to draw younger workers or individuals that have benefits elsewhere?
Oh, I do think it would draw them in. I think that there's a reluctance to do that. When in a presentation to the state personnel office, I just suggested that. I said, I pointed out the difficulties that we have in hiring younger people. When I was a younger person, I can remember, opportunities in the public sector thinking, I'm not going to use all those health benefits. Granted, they're great. So why not offer that in exchange for not having those health benefits, a little bit higher salary? The state could save money because they don't have to give them all of the money that would be spent on health benefits. They could give them a portion of it. The state would save some money. Individuals would get a higher cash compensation. I think it would work. I don't think they'll do it. That's the problem.
Yeah. A comment here from John, and then I'll hit these last two on the Q&A. So John says, I work a lot in other states and see quite similar problems. What's rarely acknowledged is the long-term insidious effect of political rhetoric denigrating government employees at every level. It's a good point, John. We know that career officials in government, are always under public scrutiny. There's always something watching, and it often is the case that they're to blame, right, quote unquote, when something wrong happens, and it makes for a challenging work environment, and that doesn't always make for a desirable place to work. A couple questions related to fire and police. I'll take the first one, and then I'll leave the second one for you. First one is, what is the possibility of looking at public safety, fire, and police statewide to get a look at our challenges? I'm assuming what you mean is kind of a shared police force or shared fire force. If that's incorrect, please correct me. And this does happen at the local level, right? We have shared services, for various municipalities. There are benefits to some of this. There are also disadvantages. Often in states that are geographically larger than us and have kind of similar rural kind of populations. Thank you for clarifying, but what we end up seeing is state police do patrol local areas and things like that. I have a question here that I think will answer the second question there too. Do you have statistics for police and fire? Both are facing critically low numbers of applicants. So kind of employment statistics related to police and fire.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't have them, but we do. And I do know that the state was looking at using some of the federal funds that came through the pandemic to look to create some incentives or some recruitment efforts for first responders and for police and fire. I know that there is actually, I believe there's a program for emergency medical personnel that's being implemented. I think it's a little bit more difficult there. They haven't worked out anything in particular on police and fire, but yes, we do know that that is a problem. We do have data on that. The number of protective workers is what the classification is. So we do have data on that, and we do know the number of job openings that are there, and we do know that governments are struggling to hire those people. And I do think that that's one of the things that it can be attacked with recruitment efforts, with incentives. And again, we just received a lot of federal money that has, some of the best uses that's been put to have been at providing incentives for workers in critical areas, either in recruitment or retention efforts. And that has been not well publicized, but I've done some analysis in order when we set up those programs of what types of incentives would be needed. So yeah, long answer. We do have data on that. We do know it's a problem, and I think there are things that can be done.
Yeah, excellent. And Justin's just reminding us, and Brian didn't. I didn't say it initially. Don't forget about EMS. When you discuss police and fire,
Right.
And I'll throw out one plug for the Carsey School. There is that we do offer a $5,000 tuition benefit to first responders for any of our graduate programs. So yeah, I mean, this is something we need to think about, something we need to look at, and something we need to solve. Well, let me first thank Brian for joining us this morning. Just really interesting data that you have. Really helpful in thinking about how we tackle this problem, and what the next steps are. So thank you so much for your time this morning. It's greatly appreciated. Also want to thank all of our attendees. We always appreciate you joining in and sharing the second Wednesday of the month with us for coffee and conversations, asking all of your questions. It's just a pleasure to do this, and we're thrilled that we're able to do this in partnership with the New Hampshire Bureau of Education and Training and the CPM Alumni Association, certified public managers of the state. So thank you all for your participation. We look forward to seeing everyone next month. Take care.